Hello, everyone. We're going to start. Please get seated. Have some food if you haven't had already. I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the director of the Future Europe Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for what is really, I think, a critical and timely conversation. I'm very happy that Special Prosecutor Mueller is a man of few words, and you didn't have to waste your day to come here. I assure you there was no collusion with his office. The Future Europe Initiative here at the Council is really committed to the idea that the resilience and success of the European Union is a critical national interest of the United States. We want to think the transatlantic relationship in all its complexity and all its diversity without any nostalgia, really looking forward and try to make it as positive as possible. And when you think about this European election, I just want to give you some perspective before turning to our panelists. Look at everything the European Union has been going through in the last 5 years since the last election in 2014. In 2014, you had the Russian aggression against Ukraine, bringing back security crisis and geopolitics to Europe. The year later, the migration crisis that had so much consequence on the rise of populists. In 2016, Britain voted to leave the European Union, the first time a member state ever decides this. And the same year, President Trump was elected President of the United States with obviously a very critical message toward the European Union and the alliance. This was really a critical election, and I think that the European population really responded in a very positive way. First, the turnout, as we're going to talk about, the turnout was higher than it's been in 20 years, higher than expected. Europeans showed in their majority their attachment to their presence in the European Union, in the euro for most of them, but many challenges lay ahead. As we've seen, this European Parliament is going to be more dispersed, more scattered, which is also a positive thing. It shows the diversity and the pluralism of European democracy, the desire for more environment and public policy, but also more identity and migration. And it's going to be very challenging for European leaders to have to navigate this diversity, have new leaders emerge, and be able to respond to these new and old challenges. And I'm really glad that we have a really comprehensive panel today with us. We're going to start with introductory remark by Antoine Ripoll, who is the head of the European Parliamentary Office here in Washington, who will give us an overview of the results and what they mean, and also what's the role and the responsibility of the European Parliament. Then we'll turn to Nicholas Yap, who is with us at the Atlantic Council with the Digital Forensics Lab, who will discuss the disinformation and foreign interference element in this campaign, which is obviously critical and something that we follow here very closely at the Atlantic Council. And then I'll turn it to Fran Burwell, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, who will have a panel with speakers from various nationalities, various expertise, as well as someone in Brussels and someone in Berlin, to give us really a detailed overview of the results, and once again, showing the diversity of what is the European Union, both Brussels and the member states, what these results mean for the different countries, and what they mean for the future of the European Union. So once again, I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank our partners at the delegation of the European Union who have supported this event and support a lot of our work. We are delighted of the work that we do with them. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Antoine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you all. Very good to, well, it goes too quickly. Here we are. My name is Antoine Ripoll. As Ben said, I head the European Parliament office in Washington. Who said the European politics is boring? Certainly not you, who are coming after these elections. So I think we are getting slowly but surely towards a Game of Thrones for Europe, so you will see. So anyway, I'm going the other way around. Let me get there. Bear with me. I was never good at technologies, but it's not. Here we are. So, as you know, I mean, you all know that, but there are two legitimacies in Europe. One represented by the European Parliament, which is the representation of the people, the citizens, 500 million until, well, we still have the UK with us, and we still always have them with us. But at the moment, we have 508 million people. And so the all decisions taken in Europe are made by the Parliament representing the people and the Member State, the Council representing the Member States. So we have two legitimacies not competing but working together. What were the preoccupations of Europeans? So difference for this election compared to the previous elections, even if one cannot overdo it, but in most previous elections, because the European elections are organized in a national way and not in a European united way, we used to have a series of 28 national debates and 28 national campaigns. This was still the case. I think it will be discussed by the panel after that. But I would argue that this time there were more common topics in this election, and you see here what were these topics. So migration was certainly one of the big topics for Europeans. The economy, stupid, so jobs and growth, always there. But also terrorism and climate. So I would say three big issues: migration, jobs and growth, the economy, what's in there for me economically, and climate. These is, so if you go to no publicity but Politico EU, you will find a more interactive, but that is just to say that these preoccupations are not, the repartition of these worries is not exactly the same everywhere. So if you sit in Poland, you will more, be interested by the issues of security. If you live in Italy or in Greece, you will be more worried by the migration issue. If you live in Spain, if you're a young person, you will be more interested in the jobs and growth issues. But this time we had more common topics, and I think we began to, it's the beginning, but we began to have a conversation between Europeans. This is something to say that we always say there's distrust towards the politics, and this is, this was done also by Politico, and it shows the distrust towards the national political scene and the European political scene. And it's interesting to see if you play with that, you will see the differences in Europe where there is more distrust towards EU and more distrust toward nations. So these are the results. This is the new parliament. So as always, no single party has the majority, so that's the constant of this parliament. There is no black and white, there is no majority and opposition. All groups are minorities, bigger or smaller, but all groups are minorities. This is why they have to compromise. It's not because they love compromise, but it's because we have to compromise. I mean, there are two options. Either the party politicians say, for me it's more important to be socialist than European, or Christian Democrat or communist or whatever it is, liberal, and I will put my ideological flag in front of it, and then that would mean that nothing is decided in Brussels, because the parliament would never, if you can see that, the fragmentation of this new parliament, and it was kind of the same before, if we put our ideological hat before our European hat, there would be nothing happening. So you would not be here, we wouldn't be talking about Europe, because we would achieve nothing. We don't do that, and so that is where it becomes interesting. So you have the first constant with before is that we have a huge plurality of parties and opinions. So it's a very diverse Europe you have here. You have basically what you have to look at is the big difference because the pro-European groups agree to work together. So the big difference, the big defining line in this parliament is not so much party line, but pro-European versus less pro-European. And it's two mixed bags, so it's very hard to talk like that. But that at the end it boils to that. So you used to have until now the two main groups, EPP, so center-right, EPP, and S&D center-left, that until now they always had the absolute majority, the two combined. This is over with this new parliament. These two parties don't have majority by themselves, and they will need even more than before. They used to do it because they did it, but now they will have to do it, otherwise they will not have the votes. So the parties on the pro-European coalition are the EPP, the S&D, the Liberals that are bigger now and that will change their name, and the Greens. So this is the pro-European majority, and so it's a new coalition. I would say that it's more probably also a new coalition a bit more to the left than it was before. So if we reflect also in the choice of the Spitzenkandidat, a process that has begun yesterday. So, and then you have the other groups, which are either on the left or on the right, but it's rather on the right, which are to different degrees anti-European. It could be a soft European anti-Europeanism or a hard one, but they are not counted in this coalition. So that's what this new parliament looks like, and that's a comparison between the former and the new one. Okay, so that's the breakdown. More or less, you could argue about 1 or 2%, but 70% of this parliament remains pro-European. 15% are soft Eurosceptics, and 13% are hard Eurosceptics. So that's the figures you have to remember. The big thing of this election were not what I just showed, is the participation. We never, I mean, as we know, polls always predict everything, n'est-ce pas? So, but this time they did not. So we did predict the composition of the new parliament. We kind of knew what we would have, but nobody predicted that we would have a surge, very important surge of participation. And so this year we had overall 28 member states, 51% of participation, which is fantastic, because you will say, well, you know, no, not such a big deal. It's only 51% out of 100. But if you compare to, so the European Parliament was first elected directly in 79, and at that time, this election, we had something like 61% turnout, which was great. And then every election after election, 5 years after 5 years, it declined. So that was always the big question that on all TVs, you know, when we were expecting the results, and had nothing to do to comment rather than turnout. So everybody was saying it's terrible, democratic deficit, people are not interested, this is so boring, these elections are so boring, nobody goes to the poll. And this time something happened, and we gained 8 points compared to last time. So I would argue that this shows that for these elections, and it coincides with what I said before, that there are common topics of conversation between Europeans. Something happened that people said, hey, there is something at stake here. It is not just the usual boring election, there's something important happening. And probably this realization came from this opposition, this dramatization of some parties saying, this is a fundamental election for Europe. Either you are for Europe or you're against Europe, but we have to fight this populism and this nationalism, and we have to, these elections are about the survival of Europe as we know it. So I think this is very interesting to see that, you know, we could have done that as European Parliament as a, you know, a good civil servants doing this propaganda, those who say that who are European, but anti-European, but really it worked, and we could see in the polls that people reacted to that. So we hope now to work on this momentum. We have to make sure in the next weeks, in the next month, in the next years, that we don't let the electors who went to the polls down, because then next time we will have a drop. So we have to be very careful on how we use this momentum. This is the turnout by country. You can surely, I mean, all of you will be interested in one or the other, but it's a bit small, so you'll have to go on the web after the event if you want to know more about your country. This is just to show that this is a comparison between, so the red is the US turnout for a presidential election, of course higher, but then the average turnout for a midterm election is lower than the one we had, and the one we normally anyway have for a European election. Now, after the new parliament will meet on July 2nd, but the big story for these next weeks will be the Spitzenkandidat. So who will be the next president of the Commission. And I'm putting these very boring paragraphs here because they show that the Spitzenkandidat is not an invention of the parliament. It's an invention of the member states, and this is the Lisbon Treaty. So the Lisbon Treaty, adopted in 2007 and ratified by all member states, said that the European Parliament elects the president of the Commission, and that it does so under the proposal of the European Council. So the European Council will take into account the European elections, will have a series of consultations with a number of partners, including the European Parliament, and will then submit to the voice of the Parliament a candidate for President of the Commission. So this is what is happening now. And so in the last election we had in 2014, the Parliament said, well, we have to put this disposal, we have to make it operational. And how do we make it operational? We're going to all the parties who want are going to elect a lead candidate, a Spitzenkandidat, as they say in German. And these candidates are going to run during the election. And that will make the election less boring, more interesting, because if people know that, like in their member state, if they vote for their MEP, this has an impact on who will lead the executive of the EU, that makes my voice more interesting, more pertinent, more. So that's what we did, and it worked last time when Juncker was, elected by the Parliament because of that. So now we have a situation that is more difficult than last time, because even if the EPP is the first group, I'm going the other way around. Even if the EPP is the other first group, the Parliament will need a majority. So when the Parliament elects normally in July the President of the Commission, it will do so. I forget that. By a majority of the members, and a qualified majority of the members. So that means that basically you have to have almost all the members of the EPP, S&D, Liberals and Greens aboard to elect the new President of the Commission. So yesterday the heads of groups, and I'm stopping there, met, and they said, one, we will not elect anybody else than one of the Spitzen, one of the lead candidates. And second, we are going to work on a draft program. So it's not just about a name, it's not just about a person, it's about the Parliament will elect this new President of the Commission under the basis of a political program. So it's a programmatic election, and it's not just Mr. X or Mr. Y. So that makes the work of the European Council quite difficult in the next weeks to come, because you need to find somebody who will find the agreement of 4 political parties and groups that are different. You need to have a geographic balance, you need to have a political balance, and you have to have a gender balance. Good luck for them. Anyway, I think, as I said at the beginning, we are entering into a more and more interesting European politics sphere, and I'm really pleased that the Atlantic Council organizes this event, and I think will be even more clever after the panel's discussion today. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Yap. I am the Associate Director here at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, or DFR Lab for short. I myself am not a Europe expert, but our team of researchers here at the Atlantic Council do a lot of work on disinformation, and we've been monitoring the EU elections very closely, so we have some top-line trends on campaigns that we've seen over the last few months that we'd like to share with you. So first off, very quick background on the DFR Lab and what we do, our methodology. We say our mission is to identify, expose, and explain disinformation with an emphasis on explaining disinformation. So how do we do that? It's through open source research. Open source data is any data that is publicly accessible, that is transparent, any one of you could access, anyone with the internet could access. And the whole reliance on open source data is to create transparency in our efforts and in our research to cut through the he said, she said back and forth that conversations about disinformation often fall into. When you have Russia invade Crimea in 2014, they say, oh, we're not there, it's a domestic uprising. NATO says, yes, you are, and it's just back and forth. What we're able to do is say, well, in fact, Russia, you are in Crimea because we have pictures of your soldiers who are posting on social media, and we can prove that those were taken where and when we think they are, and in fact, that was in Ukraine. So our start was originally looking at the security work, was looking at Russia in Ukraine, in Syria, and more so, though, we've switched to focus on narrative analysis and especially election interference, election integrity efforts. So over the last few months, we've been applying these efforts to the European elections. And what we're looking for is primarily coordinated inauthentic activity. So this is activity from accounts that are pretending to be people they're not, or pretending to have more amplification and more impact than they would otherwise have by manipulating the algorithms and the techniques of the platforms to drive the narrative in their favor. So things we're looking for are automation, for example. A lot of people talk about bots on Twitter. We're able to identify bots because they post a lot. So that's one of the easiest red flags we can look for. If you have an account posting 200 times a day, most likely that's not going to be a human, because that's one post, every few minutes during waking hours. So it's pretty easy in some cases to figure out what's fake or not. In the case of inauthentic accounts, sometimes you'll have 5 profiles that all have the same picture. Pretty obvious then that that's not an authentic account. So these are some of the very baseline red flags we're looking for when we're doing this research. In the case of the European elections, what we saw was a good amount of content, somewhat unsurprisingly, in the bigger nation states. So we saw a lot of activity in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, Poland, the UK. And the main actors that we saw engaging in disinformation campaigns in inauthentic coordinated activity were far-right populist parties. Far and beyond the biggest actor were these populist parties. The main topic, the main content that we saw them sharing was migration. As we established previously, this was a rising issue in the continent, and especially among these far-right parties and populist parties. It's one of the biggest rallying cries and ways to engage their base and create outrage. So we saw a significant amount of anti-Islam hashtags, narratives. We saw a significant amount of anti-EU, anti-immigration overall. And we also saw a rise of anti-Semitic content as well coming from these coordinated campaigns. We saw varying degrees of sophistication. Some of these were pretty straightforward, like I said. You had accounts that had the same profile picture that were very clearly not organic, that didn't have profile pictures at all, that all had the same name on Twitter, et cetera. But you also saw campaigns that had more sophisticated degrees of engagement, that were legitimately presenting themselves as organic, actually driving some significant traffic. And this is really a trend we've seen since Russia, the Internet Research Agency, St. Petersburg troll factory in 2014 and into the 2016 elections, is that these tactics are now being picked up by more actors and less so by government actors and more so by either domestic political actors or far-right actors or just commercial actors in the individual information environments. So some of the examples that we saw in Europe specifically, by far the biggest impact that we saw was a network in Spain. There was this network of Twitter accounts that had over 4.4 million posts in the course of about half a year. For reference, the IRA, after Twitter testified before Congress, they released all the data that they had about IRA activity in the 2016 US elections, and that overall database was about 10 million tweets over the course of 3 years. So this network had 4.4 million in about half a year. So it's significant in scope. The content of this was all pro-Vox. It was the far-right populist party Vox. It was pro their leader, it was pro their stances, and again, it was very heavy anti-immigrant, anti-Islam. They were pushing a hashtag, Stop Islam, this sort of content. And the reach of this was significant. It's hard to tell on back end how many accounts were reached, how many people were reached by this content, but we can extrapolate based off standard social media metrics, and we can see that probably a rough estimate of 7 billion in reach, meaning people that were exposed to this content by this network of inauthentic accounts. In traditional media terms, that's somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of media campaigning. And this was all done relatively low cost by setting up a network of accounts that were inauthentic and pushing content on Twitter. We saw a similar thing on Facebook in Spain, that pro-Vox, again, pro-anti-Islam, much less in terms of impact, but still the same amount of content. It was pro-party, it was anti-Islam, anti-immigration. One caveat through all of this is that attribution is very hard to do in our research. We can say pretty clearly what the content is, what's pushing. It's a lot harder to say it was official party apparatus that pushed this narrative. That's not to say that we're ruling that out entirely, but we're not explicitly saying this was Vox that was pushing these narratives, but they were very much aligned with them. We saw the same amount of content in Italy. There was a network of pages that had over 2 million followers on Facebook that was pushing pro Five-Star movement, pro Lega movement, again, anti-immigrant, anti-Islam. In this case, there was a lot of anti-vaccine content being spread, and had over 2 million followers, all inauthentic accounts in Italy. Same thing in Poland. This was actually one of the more interesting cases. We had a network of accounts that were pretending to be pensioners, that were older people, civilians in Poland, and they were attacking a teachers union that was protesting the government policies, and the network of accounts were pretending to be pensioners and were sharing content that was pro Polish government and was anti these protesters. And again, we found proof that these were not organic accounts, that they were inauthentic, that they were pushing this narrative and artificially amplifying it. The last thing I'll say on the content we found was even when the content wasn't necessarily inauthentic, when it was organic, when it was individuals engaging, the far-right parties significantly dominated all the conversations of the EU elections comparative to the relative size in these nations. So in Germany, for example, AfD, which is somewhere in 20% in actual makeup, had upwards of 50% of the conversation around the EU elections in Germany. So 50% of all EU election conversation was either from pro-AfD accounts or was pro-AfD content. Same thing in the UK. In the UK, we actually saw a proliferation of automated content across political parties. So I think 42% of all online content that were engaging with the main Twitter handles of official parties in the UK were automated. This showed signs of bot-like behavior. That was even more so the case for the Brexit party. They had upwards of 60% of the conversation. So all that to say that these parties who don't have as much of a mainstream standing in terms of makeup or resources or political buy-in were able to project themselves as larger actors on the overall stage because of their ability to manipulate social media either organically and more so the case inorganically. So what are they trying to achieve by this? The main thing that we're seeing is asymmetric usage of resources. It's pretty easy to set up a fake account on Facebook or Twitter. Any of you could do it. It's much harder to do it sophisticatedly in a way that gets reach, but since these actors are learning more and more so from state-run activities in Russia in 2016, et cetera, we see what we like to call an atomization of these techniques. You have individual users either in state parties or in support of far-right state parties using these techniques to manipulate the information environment. And this is interesting from the foreign perspective because a lot of people want to immediately jump to Russia. What was Russia's influence? Was there foreign influence in the elections? The evidence we have is that there wasn't explicit evidence that we can point to, explicit attribution, but that's because Russia doesn't need to. If they have these far-right parties that are pushing their narratives, that are retweeting RT Sputnik content, their same aligned messaging, they don't need to do this anymore. So it's a worrying trend in that in that we have a shift from more mainstream outlets to a almost democratization of these inauthentic coordinated tactics that far-right parties almost exclusively are using to manipulate the conversation and dominate the political activity in advance of elections primarily, but also narratives year-long. And the primary content that we've seen is hate speech, is anti-Islam, is anti-Semitic, and is anti-immigrant. And they can do this because it's low impact, it's low cost, potentially high impact. And so moving forward, we need continued research on this. We need continued amplification of efforts around it and investigation. And then I'll turn to our panel for the actual implications of what this means and what the wider election means. But we'll be continuing to do this research, and we hope that the content that we're finding is helping to shed light and break down some of these tactics. Thank you.
The whole panel should come up here. Come up. do we have Sophia on the video yet? Great. So welcome, everybody. I'm Fran Burwell, a distinguished fellow here at the Atlantic Council and longtime EU watcher. Antoine and Nick, I think, have set us up very well, set the table for our discussion. They've told us what has happened in the election, put the basic results out there, and in Nick's case told us what has happened in terms of disinformation, but also, interestingly, that the Russians were not as much directly guiding this effort, in large part because they didn't have to. So we're going to move to the next phase of our discussion, which is about winners and losers and what the implications are of this election for Europe and for individual member states, some key member states. One of the jobs of an Atlantic Council moderator is always to make sure that you understand why something that you're listening to is important. And I was reminded of that this morning when I read an op-ed in the Washington Post, which called the European Parliament weak and basically discounted the election. And I just want to put on the record that although the Parliament is a parliament, it sometimes looks very dysfunctional and is dysfunctional. One can say the same thing about Congress. But it is an institution that over the years has grown in power and impact. It's not always something that springs to the top of your mind, but it has forced, for example, the United States to renegotiate our arrangement with the EU on passenger name records. It has been a leading voice on a lot of legislation over the past year on privacy, on copyright, and many, many other issues, as well as holding budgetary power within the EU. So I think that for those of us who watch the Parliament, it is something that has grown in stature and importance. Now, there's a whole different question as to whether the European electorate sees it that way. And that's something that we certainly will talk about. I also think that this particular election was important because, as an outsider, I think I noticed more press attention to this election, including in this country and in this capital. I don't remember seeing so many stories in the mainstream US media about the previous European Parliament election 5 years ago. And then another reason I think that this particular election was important is the blowback that we have seen, which we will talk about, in some of the member states, the impact that the parliamentary elections have had on national governments and their political survival. We have a great group here to talk about this, and we have, I think, very wisely brought in people not only because they are, each of them, extremely knowledgeable, but also we have a good representation of countries. And so we will talk about this on both the European level and the country level. I'm going to do the very brief introductions in the order of go, and then we will start the discussion. So our first up after we get started will be Sophia Bosch, who is a research fellow at the Center for European Reform and also a non-resident fellow here at the Council. She works primarily on European defense policy, and she's also been a fellow at NATO headquarters. And if you want to hear more from her after you finish today, she hosts the CER podcast on some weeks. Then we have Emiliano Alessandra, who is also he's a transatlantic fellow over at the German Marshall Fund. He has worked primarily on Mediterranean issues. He's also worked at the Institute of International Affairs in Rome and at Brookings. Celia Belin, who is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. She has also previously worked on transatlantic relations at the French Foreign Ministry's policy planning staff. Unfortunately, Jeremy Cliff couldn't join us today, for those of you who were hoping to hear the British perspective, but I'm sure that we will talk about that. And then Bart Oosterveld, my colleague here at the Atlantic Council, he runs the Global Business and Economics program and works on the European economy, economic sanctions, finance, and trade. And he was previously in the real world as an executive at Moody's Investors Service. And Katerina Sukul, who is the Washington correspondent for Katamerini and SKAI TV, Sky TV. She is also a non-resident fellow here at the Atlantic Council, and she's working on a book on the Greek financial crisis. Now, I understand that before we actually get started in the discussion, we had asked Marietta Schaake, who is, I think, one of the leading MEPs from the last parliament, to give us a few thoughts on this election. Marietta has been a strong participant in Atlantic Council events, both here in Washington and in Europe. And so I think we have a tape. She couldn't actually join us in real time, but I think we have a very brief video. Is that right? Okay.
Hi everybody, my name is Marietje Schaake. I'm an outgoing member of the European Parliament from the Liberal group, and I'm Dutch. And it's really a good moment to share with you some observations about the European Parliament elections. Everybody's just coming back here today, old colleagues greeting each other and congratulating or sharing the misery of the results of the European Parliament elections. A few observations. A lot has been made about the changing dynamic of the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, quote unquote, no longer having the majority together. I think it's a bit of a simplified picture of the past European Parliament, because in fact, oftentimes the divisions ran between the Conservatives or the Progressives on the other side. In other words, we as Liberals were often in the middle, determining where the majority would fall, and it was really not a grand coalition in the way that the German government worked for a long time. And so the Liberals, the group that I belong to, remains a very important player, not only because we almost doubled in size, which is really exciting, but also because we will be in a king-making position. And I hope that that will also translate into opportunities for Margrethe Vestager. She is currently the Commissioner for Competition, and her name is one of the top nominees. She's very popular for leading the next European Commission. But of course, a lot is still unpredictable. Everybody's trying to look at how the horses are going to run, whether the Spitzenkandidaten system, where candidates for the top jobs were known ahead of time, will survive, or whether new names can still come out of a high hat. So we will have to see. What is also important to look at is clearly the predictions versus the outcomes of the nationalist and far-right parties. I think it's safe to say that a number of them did not break through in the way that was feared by people like myself or hoped by the candidates in the field, but in some countries, Poland, Hungary, Italy, the United Kingdom and France, the results for nationalists are deeply troubling, and we can only wait and see whether they're going to work together more effectively and how they're going to roll out their agenda of undermining the EU from within. And the same questions about cooperation and getting results are relevant for the other political groups. It is not only about the sizes of the groups, but also about the cohesion within groups. And if I look at a topic that I've worked on for the past 10 years, international trade on the basis of rules, I would say that's an area to watch, because we as Liberals have grown with a significant number of French representatives who tend to be more protectionist. And then there's also the Greens, who have never supported bilateral trade agreements, that find themselves in a more important position and with a fundamental choice of whether they're going to continue to reject a number of outcomes because it's not good enough for them, not green enough for them, or whether they're going to find themselves more inclined to join a constructive, results-oriented coalition of representatives and parties that are going to continue to build a stronger Europe. Because with everything that's going on in the world, climate change, migration and demographic changes in Europe's neighborhood, conflict, terrorism from the far right, as well as from Islamists and other religiously inspired violent actors, to the question of jobs of tomorrow, competition from China, how we're going to deal with digitization to make it a force for good. The challenges are significant, and these are all areas where we need to work together well. And I hope that the more diverse makeup of this new parliament will lead to more interesting debate, will engage people, will bring the issues closer to home, but will also find compromise and results, because after all, that is what we're here for, not for the big names and the egos and the sort of horse race of who gets to the top jobs, but really for sustainable plans and solutions that serve the people of Europe. Now, I hope you'll have an interesting debate about other aspects of these elections, and hopefully a little bit on the future of transatlantic relations, which can go different directions, sort of Trumpian alliances or more progressive, values-based transatlantic relation. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person, but I hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Great. So let's bring Sophia back. And I think that Marietta has really given us a great kickoff here, because I think she's spoken not only about the results and what they mean, but this potential split that I think is even happening in the Council now, where you have governments in Hungary and Poland having been reinforced, and Italy having been reinforced in their nationalist tendencies. But what she brought up at the end, I think, is something that has not been covered a lot in the discussions so far, and that is the impact on policy. The Parliament is an important policy actor. It is a co-legislator. It approves every single trade agreement that the EU signs, and how these divisions work out, what it means in these party groups, is going to be something that is key over the next 5 years. But we want to start by looking at some of the big picture items. And Sophia, in this first round, we will talk more on the European level, and then I'm going to come back to everyone to ask more specific national-based questions. But what do you, Sophia, looking from Berlin, see as the implications of this election for Europe? There were a lot of fears of a serious Eurosceptic shift, and it didn't happen. But what did we get? What did happen, if not that? And the other thing I would ask you to comment on is the degree to which this was a European election, or was it just a collection of national elections?
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm really happy to join us. In response to the question, Fran, I think broadly these elections are good news. A strong Eurosceptic force in the European Parliament could have done a lot of harm, and it's a relief that the shifts in the European party system that we have seen have turned out more nuanced than that, with smaller parties from all directions taking seats from the two established blocs. I think that the high turnout and the strong showing of the smaller parties like the Greens at a European level is indeed an indication that voters were thinking along European lines and prioritize policy issues over personnel politics. And with the greater range of parties that are now represented in the European Parliament, I think we could see some real debate in this next legislative period going forward, with coalitions forming along ideological lines, issue to issue, which is, I think, a rather new development. In the past, the European Parliament has focused more on institutional struggles, and now going forward, it could become a more political body, I think. The question for me is whether European national governments will be brave enough to embolden the institutions in response to this strong showing that we've seen for Europe. And the first test case for that will be the fight over who becomes Commission president. We're currently seeing the clash between Merkel and Macron and others. Now the Spitzenkandidatenprozess is a German invention, unsurprisingly perhaps, and the lead candidate of the Green Party is also German, so Manfred Weber. So Merkel officially supports him. But he's also not the best candidate for the job, and Merkel knows that too. He's not very inspiring. He's a sort of bureaucratic manager type that I think personally would go against this tidal wave of European empowerment that we've seen in these elections. So this is not all said and done. We should talk more about this perhaps in the next round in the Q&A, but I would agree with Marietje that Margrethe Vestager, the Danish candidate, is one to watch.
Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of handicapping throughout our talks here for the head of the European Commission, who is someone who, as was explained earlier, may come out of the results of this election. But for the moment, and I think at the end I'm going to ask everyone to put their vote out on the table, or their guess out on the table. But Emiliano, I want to go back to this idea of the creation of a European demos. Was this election a turning point? Is there something European that the European leaders should now empower? Or is this just still reflect a collection of national votes and everything was very specific? I mean, I can look at some of these and it's clear that they're national reflections. But we used to say that the European Parliament election was the way that European voters, an opportunity for European voters to criticize their existing government. Is that still what it is?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me and for the opportunity to speak. And I agree with you. I think there were a lot of country-specific dynamics at play. At the same time, I think it is a turning point. And I think those of us, and I hope we are many, who believe in a united and strong Europe should feel relieved after these elections. We are not meeting for a sort of post-mortem. Far from that, we are meeting to celebrate, in my view, if not the vibrancy, at least the resilience of European democracies. And the higher than average turnout, historic in some countries, is very encouraging. And the good news is that the newly elected parliament, as Antoine has already showed, has a broad-based pro-EU, pro-integration majority. At the same time, I think we should not be complacent. I think that anti-EU sovereignist parties made significant gains. They didn't have the sort of landslide victory they hoped for, but they still made very significant gains. And they came out on top in key countries, not just Hungary and Poland, but also France, Italy, and not to speak of the UK with the Brexit party. And if they are able to coordinate among each other, and that's a major challenge for them because there are lots of political differences between them, I think they can still have a meaningful impact on the policy-making process at the European Union level, including when it comes to defining the composition of the next European Commission. And they're facing a new majority, and I like the comments, the very powerful points that Marietta made from Brussels. They're facing a majority that is very broad-based, but also very heterogeneous, and could be potentially more fragmented within groups and between groups on key policy issues. And we could see nationalist and sovereigntist parties trying to drive wedges between some of these groups and maybe succeeding on some instances. So we shouldn't be complacent at all, but we should be all celebrating, I think, the overall encouraging results of the European elections, which are, I think, creating a European demos, but we're not there yet. I think there were pan-European themes these times, there were European narratives, there were divides on migration, the future of the EU, but there were, in many respects, still 28 different elections, often fought also on national platforms, and they had, significant national sort of significance in a number of countries, including Italy, which is a different story, but I will come to that later. But let me just say that if Italy was Europe and vice versa, we would not be celebrating now a pro-EU majority. Italy is actually now on the extreme of the Eurosceptic spectrum. Yeah.
Yes. Celia, much has been made of the high turnout. A number of speakers have already said something about this. Why do you think there was this high turnout? I mean, we're so used to voters being apathetic about the European Parliament elections. Was it the national? And I noticed that the turnout varied quite a lot country by country. So can you speak to this and why? Is this a turning point in terms of future elections, or the voters focus on Europe as opposed to their national polities?
You
did see a high turnout. You have a record turnout in 20 countries out of 28, with some countries voting less than usual, but a huge majority voting more, close to 51% participation. And I think it comes from the fact that that the Europeans felt they needed to say something, they needed to express their personal preferences, and for different reasons. First, because they believe they are under threat. And you have, Ben recalled it at the beginning of this event, there's been a series of external threats to the EU, with increasing great power competition, with territorial annexation of Crimea, with higher terrorism, including on European ground, and dangers for society on that front. You've had a series, and plus the migration crisis of 2015 and 16, a series of threats that have heightened the threat perception of Europeans and clearly pushed them to get interested in what was the direction of the EU. Other threats, another category of threats, are internal, actually, and they stem from a rise in populism and nationalist forces, starting with Brexit in 2016, but also with a sort of an echo in the US with the Trump election. There was a big question on, are we witnessing a global wave of populism and nationalism all across Western democracies? And it's both served as a fuel for some of these movements on the nationalistic side, but also as a repellent, but a mobilizing repellent that Europeans that reject nationalism and populism needed to go out and vote. So I think you've had that. But I would say there's a second motivation. The second motivation for high participation is the motivation for change. The profound desire, first the fatigue with the establishment, and the profound desire to just shake up politics. And you see that across the board. It's no surprise that you've had massive national political consequences of these elections in the UK with the May going, in Greece with the snap elections being called, possibly in Germany where you could see a leadership change, because you've had Europeans saying in big waves no to the establishment, to mainstream parties. You've had both the EPP and Social Democrats together, the Conservative bloc and the Social Democratic bloc, losing 80 seats in this particular election. So the result is a much more fragmented parliament, which is much more diverse and much more representative of a desire for change. And the last point is that for the right, the choice for change, when you want change from status quo, you either pick a nationalistic direction or more liberal, so that's why ALDE did so good. On the left, you have also two different tendencies, the tendency to pick liberalism, going back to ALDE, or a more ecological change there. So I think you had options for Europeans, and they took it, and that's why we have this result.
So let me ask one follow-up on that, and that's that one of the big winners out of this election was the Green Party. And I recall as in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, it seemed like there was a real focus, at least I was in Germany briefly, and so that's not surprising, but there was a real focus on climate. And I think Antoine pointed out earlier that climate change was something that, particularly in the north of Europe, really seemed to resonate with voters. Do you think that, is this a wave of climate change activists that has helped affect this parliament? Will we see that continue in this parliament as it looks at its policy agenda?
So as we saw in Europe, climate change is a preoccupation that's only increasing with Europeans all across Europe. The reality is that the EU is both a very effective regulatory body to deal with specific pollution, specific elements dealing with either pollution or environmental challenge or energy transition, but it is also an enabler of some of the worst element of industrial policy. We all know that Brussels is full of pro-oil big lobbies, that the petrochemical industries are very powerful. And so you have very strong internal battles within the EU. And I think there's a ripple effect because Green parties all across Europe know that the battle needs to be fought in Brussels. That's where it's going to happen. There's a climate, as much as there's a unified trade policy, you also have a unified climate policy. That's an enormous importance. So you know that's where it's going to be relevant. And I think that did participate. And the second element for mobilization is the youth mobilization, is the climate action by young people taking marches. You have the Olga, I'm missing her name, phenomenon that is very popular of young people at an extremely young age, 16, 17, really talking about their generation's struggle and pushing this agenda.
So Bart, when you look at this parliament and the diversity or the divisions that we see now, what does it, first off, I mean, you focus on the economy. So to what degree was the economy an influencer in this election, especially when you're talking about such disparate economies? And what does this say about future economic policy in the Union? What can we expect given the diversity of the parliament?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, especially as it relates to the euro area, and I'll get into that. I think rather than a focus on the fragmentation, I think there's a lot of good news to be found in not just a higher turnout and participation and interest that people have mentioned, but Marietje Schaake mentioned, the role of the Liberal Democrats as representatives of the median voter, a potential broker of agreements across the parliament. I agree very much with what Antoine said, that there's a solid majority, not just the three traditional European political families, Liberal Democrats, Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, that support the European project. If you add the Greens, it's just, the median voters' preferences are solidly captured in that bloc, and that argues for a stronger and more dynamic Europe. On the environmental vote, just to add that, yes, you see it in the success of the Greens. It's also broadly carried across platforms of all these political platforms. Climate change denial is not as accepted in Europe as it is in other jurisdictions. It's just most of us enjoy the thought of our great-grandchildren being able to sit on panels as well. And so on leadership, in the Commission, I'll say two things. I think Europe needs not just a competent bureaucrat, but a strong leader for a number of immediate and longer-term reasons. So an immediate one is Brexit. Brexit needs to be managed as best as possible, or as good as British domestic politics will allow. And that requires a strong hand in Europe. It is in nobody's interest to have a very disruptive outcome when it comes to Brexit, least of all several European countries, including the Netherlands. So that's one. Second, and others are more qualified to talk about the Commission jobs and the ECB job. And I think the EU has been served very well by Cecilia Malmström, and I think it's critically important, given the current environment in trade, that there be a strong commissioner on trade. I think you have one of the more important jobs to fill, and one that doesn't rise to the top of the list when people talk about these topics. A few things about economic risks. I think an outsized risk remains, especially in a lower growth environment, Italy, and an emboldened Salvini with the attitude that he might take towards Brussels in these budget battles could be very disruptive, and it does only take a bit of a yield spike to create a lot of urgency and a lot of very difficult decisions around these topics. Despite the progress that's been made in terms of the ESM firepower and the confidence and capacity building that happened during the crisis about firewalling problems and creating solutions, which is much augmented from the start of the European debt crisis. That could be a very disruptive debate, and like I said, it doesn't take much to tip that over, even though for Italy to run a small primary surplus and make the problem go away is not that hard either. They could just decide to do that. Finally, I worry a bit about the prospects for deeper Eurozone reform, and I think that remains critically important. We do need common deposit insurance, we do need a banking union, we do need a capital markets union. In the end, we will need a safe Eurozone asset. even though people don't like to talk about that, but that's an economic reality. So those are some of the things on my mind.
Great. Katerina, there's been a lot of talk since the financial crisis, but reinforced by the migration crisis, about a divide in Europe between North and South. And I wondered if you think that this parliament, or this election, indicates any way forward out of that, or whether that's going to continue to persist. Has Europe have the pro-European forces even if you just talk about them, found a way forward with this election?
Well, thank you again. I'm very happy to be here, and that's my first event with the Atlantic Council as a non-resident senior fellow, so I'm especially thankful for it. I mean, I remember Greece has been in a crisis for the last 10 years, and if you think that you would want a more political Europe, be careful what you wish for, in a way. Because I remember the federalists back home in easier times saying that, we wish for a more political Europe, and then next thing you know, the crisis hit us, and it was very political and very real for us, and Europe came home, basically, in the form of the creditors and the surveillance of the Greek economy. So I feel that the rest of Europe is catching up to very real challenges, economic and migration-wise, that are a common threat throughout Europe, North and South, by the way. But I guess the urgency of some of these issues is first felt in the South, yes. Some countries in the North maybe have more leeway or the luxury to contemplate how to deal with this crisis, or feel that they can go on their own rather than deal with the problem as a pan-European one. So that brings me to the great divide that I think that is currently taking place in Europe. Similarly to what us correspondents from the US are reporting back home about the divided US after the Trump election, it's very much a cleavage, a divide between, I would say, the sovereigntists or nationalists, if you want to put it like that, and the integrationalists rather than progressives, I would say, because it's a matter of whether you think that the problems can be dealt with in a pan-European way or not, rather than if you're progressive or not, I would argue. So I feel that this parliament might actually, in the tradition of the European Parliament, of coming together, compromising between groups and within groups, I find that this will continue, and if anything, the rise of the Liberals and the Greens in the Parliament is a good sign for further making the European Parliament relative to the very real problems of today. At the same time, at the European Council level, for example, it will be much harder there to reach the concessions that are needed to bring Europe forward. And there, yes, I mean, what's happening in Italy, France, with Britain, obviously, Hungary, Poland, will have an impact on how Europe is being driven forward. And one last point on the German-French alliance, the engine, the traditional engine that is pushing Europe forward. How is this going to proceed, given what's happened in France and how the German government is feeling about the results of the European Parliament elections? So these are some of the issues that I feel that the European Council would be more challenged than the European Parliament going forward.
Well, that's a great segue to our next round of questions. And I think it's a really interesting point you've raised about how certain member state governments may feel more emboldened because they had a strong showing in these elections, and that may result in different behavior in the European Council, which is the body in which the member states make decisions. So we'll have to see how that plays out, but it's interesting to see how the parliament elections could have an impact even on that. Let me go to Sophia, because I think one of the striking things of this election was the losses not only by the EPP, but by the CDU in Germany. And the Chancellor did not campaign all that much, at least for those of us watching across the pond here. She wasn't as visible on this. And instead, her designated successor, Anne-Greta Kramp-Karrenbauer, otherwise known as AKK, and we can all call her that for the rest of the panel discussion, was actually saying that they hadn't done so well afterwards. And I wonder what you think, Sophia, about what this means for the coalition in Germany, what it means for AKK's future, and the Chancellor's timetable on stepping down.
Sure, yeah. So let me talk a little bit about the results in Germany in general, about the German story in these elections, and then I'll come to the future of the government. So the German results at a national level, I think, almost mirrored the EU results. The two big parties lost. Merkel's CDU went from around 35 in the last European elections to just below 30% of the vote, and the Social Democrats lost even more. They went from 27 to 15% of the votes. The Greens, on the other hand, almost doubled their results. So maybe just briefly on the Green surge in Germany, I think, yes, that is a sign of increased concern over climate change. That was the biggest motivation for German voters, but it's not only that. And I think sometimes for non-Germans, you need to recall that the Green Party is actually a fairly established party in Germany. It's not a fringe party like in many other European countries. And the Greens benefited in these elections from the demolition of the Social Democrats, from a CDU that under the leadership of AKK can no longer, I think, hold the young voters that were attracted to Merkel's centrist politics, and also for having positioned themselves as the response to the right-wing Alternative for Germany. The Alternative for Germany itself came in fourth, with 11%. It did worse than it did in the federal elections in 2017. I think that's because immigration was ranked relatively low among the topics that mattered to German voters in these elections. That is, we have to say though, with the exception of Germany's seat, where the Alternative for Germany came in second in 3 states that have regional elections this autumn. AfD, I think, has sort of firmly established itself as Germany's east now, which is really a headache for Merkel's CDU, which is now led by AKK. So what does this all mean for Merkel's government? I think what we've seen is that AKK in crisis mode now is demonstrating a real lack of authority and a lack of leadership skills. She's not navigating this well, and she's really been weakened in her position as Merkel's chosen successor over the last few months, I'd say, but particularly with these elections, which I think makes Merkel more reluctant to leave the job early on the one hand. On the other hand, also puts more pressure on her to perhaps step aside and let AKK shine before the elections in 2021. It also means that the Lions are coming forward, so AKK might in the end face more challengers for the top job in the CDU. And the question is, can the Grand Coalition, so the coalition between the SPD and the Conservatives, survive this move? That's sort of the question that's looming over every development in German politics right now, because this coalition is so fragile. I think the question that we have to ask is, what would the SPD, what would the Social Democrats actually have to gain from getting out of the Grand Coalition, from new elections? In new elections, they would fare badly, I think. Plus, the European Parliament election results shouldn't really have come as a shock to the Social Democrats. They've been doing really badly in polls and national polls over the last couple of years, and if they wanted to leave, they could have. That being said, there might be personnel change at the head of the Social Democrats. Mrs. Nahles, who leads them, has put a challenge up to her critics to come forward. It's a really thankless job at the moment, though, because they will likely in future regional elections. So I'm personally skeptical that this might blow up soon. But I think the lesson for Europe is that the other countries will probably have to keep waiting for strong German leadership. In fact, I would recommend that they stop waiting, because that's what we've done for the past few years, and Berlin hasn't been able to come through because it's been too preoccupied with itself, with domestic politics.
Thank you very much. And Emiliano, if there is one victor out of these elections, is it Matteo Salvini? And what does that mean for Italy and its role in Europe?
Definitely, I mean, Salvini was the clear winner in the Italian elections. His league got 34% of the vote. He got 17% of the vote last year in the general election, so he more than doubled. But in terms of votes, that's actually a little bit less significant because the turnout was different. But on the one hand, there was the surge of the league, which was very significant. The league becoming really a nationwide hegemonic party. For those of you who follow Italian politics, you may remember that the League is the evolution of the Northern League, a party that initially was very much focused on regional issues in the center north of Italy. But the surge of the League has to be contrasted and is offset by the loss of support for the Five-Star Movement, which was until now the sort of major shareholder of this unlikely coalition government of populists that already put a little bit Italy in a league of its own since last year. So on the one hand, clearly in Italy there is at present no pro-EU majority to speak of, but Italy, I would argue, is only marginally more Eurosceptic today than it was a year ago. And Salvini and the government more broadly will, in my view, struggle to navigate this post-European election environment because in terms of options that are available to them, it's really difficult to see how they're going to leverage Italian interest in this new parliament, in these new European institutions that will be forming. Whether the government will collapse as a result of this dramatic change in the balance of power between the two coalition parties. That's, I think, too early to say, and the indications for now is that they will try to stay together. They recommitted to the alliance they formed a year ago, but it's not to be ruled out that Matteo Salvini in particular will decide, down the road to pull the plug, drop the Five-Star Movement if it becomes a liability, and try to maybe resurrect from an hegemonic position a center-right coalition by reaching out to what is left of Berlusconi's party, which performed, got less than 10% of the vote. But even in that case, I would argue, because of the political balances we just discussed within the European Parliament, it would be very difficult for Salvini to build alliances because there's no possibility at the moment of any alliance between the European People Party and the more sovereigntist and national groups. That has been ruled out by either leaders on each side and is not supported by numbers in the parliament. So Italy faces a concrete risk of diplomatic isolation and political isolation. And just months ago, or at least a year ago, Italy was heralded, especially by Europe's detractor, as the possible harbinger or forerunner of new populist political experiments, and Italy finds itself now, on the contrary, quite isolated. So, in a more Eurosceptic Europe, but more similar in some respect to countries to the east, than to countries to the west.
Okay. Celia, Emmanuel Macron, President Macron, came second. Once again, seeing what they cannot call the National Front anymore, the National Challenge.
National Rally.
A national rally, more of a national challenge. But so,
That's a good name.
is this a defeat for President Macron, or is this just people are kind of fed up right now in the middle of his presidential term? And actually, I think that Marine Le Pen did less well than she has done in previous elections. But how is this being perceived now in France, and in terms of Macron's ability to be a leader in Europe?
So it's technically a defeat, just because he came in second, but he's 1 point away from Marine Le Pen. So Marine Le Pen sort of repeated her performance of 2014, 1 point less, I think. And you have this configuration of the two first parties that validate the idea that what happened in 2017 was not an accident, that now the voters' preference are between Macron and Le Pen, between National Rally and La République En Marche. With these two opposites as options, and that's very much how both sides framed it during the entire campaign. So Macron calls it the nationalists versus the progressives, and Marine Le Pen calls it the patriots versus the globalists. But basically, they are saying the same things. However, it's not what's surprising about this technical defeat is that it came out in the press as almost a victory for Macron. Why? Because he came out of 6 months of a deep social crisis with yellow vest protest movements every Saturday in the streets, and really a moment in time at the end of 2018 where his entire presidency was put in question almost. Second, the campaign itself, he had a first person on his list, Nathalie Loiseau, that underperformed versus, Jordan Bardella, the head of the list for the National Front, the Rally Front. The National Rally. Sorry, I can't get used to it. Who did quite well. So all in all, he sort of held up his game here. And part of the reason is that he made it so a referendum on Marine Le Pen, who is always a good way to win votes, but also last minute in the last few weeks, he really pushed the ecological agenda because he knew it was a way to just keep a few maybe center-right, center-left voters that were ready to vote green. However, you have to realize that Macron plus Le Pen is 45% of the vote only. So it means 55% of the French refuse the dichotomy between, nationalists and progressives or patriots and globalists. And they voted in many, many different ways, and we can come back to it.
Okay. I'm going to skip over to Katrina to talk about Greece and come back to you, Bart, with a question not only about the Netherlands, but also about the US. So, Katrina, Alex Tsipras has now called an election. What does this mean after a dismal showing in the European Parliament elections? What is going on in Greece now?
So these were specifically exceptional elections for Greece in the sense that traditionally for European Parliament elections, people tend to vote loosely. They don't feel that they need to support a governing party, and smaller parties tend to gain more of the vote that they do in the national elections. This election was very significant because the difference between the first and the second party, New Democracy and Syriza, was 9.3 percentage points. This is the highest it has ever been in a European Parliament election. And in anticipation, that happened very much because we were expecting national elections to take place normally by October. The fact that the difference was so high, and the fact that the election had been framed by both parties as a referendum for or against the government actually left Tsipras very few choices but to call for a snap election, as he had done, by the way, when he had won the previous European Parliament elections in 2014, basically pushing the then New Democracy government out of power through a presidential election that was due to take place. So they also had to call for early elections. And Tsipras now basically got his nemesis in a way, got what he had as a member of the opposition to do for the previous government. So I feel that it had been indeed a referendum to the government, for the government, these elections, and the fact that he lost left him very few choices. Now, these elections were also important for Greece because in a way, populism lost in Greece. The Prime Minister, just a couple of weeks before the elections, basically announced a series of measures, handouts they were called, to some most vulnerable parts of the population, but also he kind of questioned again the primary surplus targets that we have with as part of the repayment of the debts. And the creditors in Europe weren't happy with that. It will be an issue that will be in the press for for the next few weeks, for sure. And the New Democracy government is expected to, the New Democracy Party is expected to win, according to all polls coming forward. So it will be a new government, most probably by the end, by early July in Greece. And that will, again, one final point about that is that in 2014, Greece was also scary in the European Parliament elections because Golden Dawn was a neo-Nazi party, basically, was elected in third place. And it was an indication and a warning sign for what is happening in Greece, but also for the rest of Europe. So Golden Dawn has been contained to less than 5%. There's another far right party that has arisen and will gain a seat in parliament, but it's not in the European Parliament, but it's not as scary as the neo-Nazis of Golden Dawn. So I feel that for now, this far-right nationalism of extreme proportions has been contained in Greece, partly within the New Democracy Party, by the way.
So perhaps a model or an example for the future of some other European countries who are struggling right now with
Bloomberg
far
had an article like that
Yes.
just today.
Yeah.
In relation to Italy, by the way.
So Bart, one of the first things out of the elections was the exit polls that showed the left in the Netherlands doing rather well, unexpectedly well. Is this the end of kind of the Dutch issue with Euroscepticism, or are you back to being good Europeans? But the other question that I wanted to raise is, and I think this is something after this, I'm going to open this to the floor. And I think since you have spent so much time here and work so much on US-EU economic issues, what do you see coming out of this election for US-EU economic issues?
Okay, thank you. The Dutch issue with anti-immigrant, far right-wing Eurosceptic parties, is it the end? No, it's reasonably under control. They did well in the last national elections, but were kept out of the coalition. Thankfully, the leaders of those two parties don't really allow others around them to be competent, so they create their own problems and cyclically kind of go in and out to create noise, and they're disruptive. Like populists do best when they don't have responsibility and can throw stuff from the outside and say disruptive things, and that's their role. In terms of the Dutch role in Europe, it's the Dutch will have to grapple with the loss of the Brits much more than any others, because those were natural allies, pro-trade, with a deregulatory bent. Kind of the Dutch government often found itself allied in Brussels with the Brits, and that's a problem. Our finance minister has seen fit to lead this Hanseatic League, which is not constructive and not helpful to the broader dialogue of deeper economic integration. It was good to see him partnering with the French and the Germans on a new proposal for the Capital Markets Union, and so. We were helped by an experienced prime minister who's leading his fourth cabinet, so that's good, and who has no open European ambitions. So, who's apparently staying on the domestic scene. In terms of the EU-US dialogue, the topic that needs to rise to the top is the trade dialogue, which is. Like what Frank Zappa said about jazz, it's not dead, but it smells funny. There is disagreement about even what to talk about. There was an agreement late July last year about the kind of dialogue that could be had. Then the U.S. reversed course and said they wanted to discuss agriculture as well, which is, Lighthizer knows full well that that's not on the agenda in Europe, and Malmström never even sought that mandate to talk about. So it's hard to see that going, with the U.S. primaries heating up soon. It's hard to see that going anywhere. That being said, the EU is too large to, when smaller countries visit here, and if they're flying under the radar on trade issues, I think that the honest advice to give them is, well, if you're flying under the radar now, try to keep flying under the radar for a bit longer. The EU is too large and needs to engage with the U.S. and try to have the best dialogue with Ambassador Lighthizer that it can have.
But do you think, for example, the Parliament has to approve all trade negotiations, trade treaties when they're done. If there were some kind of an agreement with the United States, do you think that this particular parliament that we've seen so far is going to be interested in that? Is that
I
something?
don't see discussions advancing rapidly. A good trade agreement with two willing parties takes years to negotiate. So we're not anywhere near the situation where we need to worry about the hypothetical, will Parliament approve it? Neither party has the ambition even to have talks like that. And thankfully, there's nothing to renegotiate. There's no US-EU NAFTA that can be torn up, renegotiated, and redone. So that's, I guess, a blessing.
Okay. So let me open this to the floor now and bring you all in for questions. We have some questions? Yeah. Did I see a question in the back there? There we go.
Good afternoon. I'm Lucy Menagita. I'm coming from France. And so obviously these European elections were really important. You highlighted it. And if these results are, so from my point of view, a relief, because it was not as bad, or the nationalist surge was not as strong as we could have feared. No, the next step is really how the Spitzenkandidat will be chosen, the next Commission president. And here, I'm afraid we could miss the momentum we have perhaps gathered. And I was wondering actually how if you see that there is a dynamic to really find a compromise, if our European leaders will be able to really make the good choice. So it's hard to say good, bad. But for example, yesterday, Emmanuel Macron, when he he concluded the council, he did not mention Manfred Weber as a potential candidate, and Angela Merkel would more support him. So how do you feel the future for this important choice? I think will be really crucial for the future of the European project. So
well, let me go first to Sophia and then to Celia, and then ask others if they have thoughts to chime in. As we saw the leaders meeting last night, and in the lead up to that, it was Angela Merkel was standing firm on Manfred Weber, and President Macron was quite the opposite. And was dismissive of the whole Spitzenkandidaten situation. So, Sophia, first to you. How strong is Merkel's loyalty to Weber? And as I commented to a friend the other day, we should remember what she did to Helmut Kohl. So, I mean, at what point is she going to throw Manfred Weber under the bus? Or is she going to hold out, and at what cost? Because I frankly find it difficult to say that the group that lost the most in the parliamentary elections gets to appoint their leader. And we can let Antoine say something if he wants. So, Sophia, what do you think?
Well, all right. So I think you're right that Angela Merkel is not particularly sentimental. I think it's also not a secret that she's not particularly attached to Manfred Weber as a person. He's a member of the CSU, the Bavarian sister party of the CSU. He's just not a very strong candidate. He hasn't been very strong in domestic politics. He's not very strong in European politics. She does support the Spitzenkandidaten process, and there are some reasons why she might want somebody like Weber at the head of the Commission, because that would mean that in the Council versus Commission power struggle, the Commission ends up weaker than the Council, which means that there's more room for intergovernmental policymaking in the EU. And that's sort of the position that she has held to so far. We always knew that this clash was coming. We always knew that Emmanuel Macron was never going to accept this. I think she has more reason to perhaps not stick to Weber at all costs. She knows that that might lead to a bit more of a German backlash, anti-German backlash with a sense that the Germans are taking on all the important jobs in Brussels. Brussels speaks German now, that kind of narrative. So I also think that if you listen to her recent statements, we're speculating now, but if you listen to her recent statements, she's sort of opening the pathway for not necessarily sticking to Weber by saying that it's necessary for all parties to compromise and show some tolerance. So even though this is her official position, Weber's her official candidate, I wouldn't bet on it.
Celia, what do you think? What will President Macron do in the end?
So I have zero inside information. It's just my political gut feelings on this. My impression, as we said, so Weber is not that popular. However, for Merkel, she has to support it. And she has to support him up until the point that people have talked about Michel Barnier as a potential contender for a sort of outside candidate that did very well at Brexit negotiations, and that could be brought on as a sort of a compromise candidate, given that he was a conservative back in France. However, I don't see that happening, how Merkel could support a French conservative in a job that is, directed towards a German conservative by just the Spitzenkandidat process. So I think, if she needs to compromise, it would be easier for her to go all the way towards something completely different. A female candidate is easier to accept because you make history, and so you can just grab on somebody else. So
President Tusk has been saying how there needs to be 2 women out of the 4.
Sure, and so that would be a good time. That's why Vestager, as the lead candidate for the Liberals, is a sort of an obvious potential guess. Everybody has said that Frans Timmermans, the lead candidate for the Social Democrats, had done a very good campaign, that he's personally very well integrated. He speaks 7 languages. He's just the perfect candidate, except is on the wrong side. So picking, you talked about how paradoxical it would be to take the lead candidate from the party that has lost the most. It's also paradoxical to take the lead candidate for the second party who has lost the most. So that's all I have so far.
Okay. Antoine, did you want to say anything on this? Can we get a mic up here for Antoine? Is the Parliament's official person in the room?
I don't want to lose my job, so I won't enter into the names. But what is really important for the Parliament is 2 things. One is to have, as President of the Commission, one of the Spitzenkandidaten. I think it is fundamental for all the pro-European groups. And second, to have somebody who will be strong enough to build on the momentum that this election gave. So I think we need somebody credible. Of course, they're all credible, but the most credible possible to build on this momentum. I think it's a special moment for Europe, and we need somebody who will be able to push that moment.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just briefly comment on that?
Yes, but we're getting more questions from the audience now, so brief.
I can do it. No, I was going to say that I tend to believe that it will be one of the Spitzenkandidaten, and because if that doesn't happen, you sort of break, you already have a precedent that breaks, a new sort of rule that was, and that would create a precedent in a way. And charismatic leaders, heads of states, heads of governments, at the end of the day, do not want, in my view, a very strong president of the European Commission. So why not going for one of the Spitzenkandidaten, and maybe from the Liberals, saying, it doesn't have to be the one of the major party. It has to be the one who can find, larger, support in the Parliament.
Okay, let me bring in the gentleman in the front.
Thank you very much. I'm from the Voice of America Russian Service. My question is to Dr. Alessandri and Dr. Bellin. We see from your observation that hard right, ultra-right parties and anti-EU parties in these elections came with kind of mixed achievements. But can we expect that after these elections, in which they are kind of, by common opinion, underperformed, they will form some rather stronger, we could say, nationalistic international, like more blocking between them inside the Europe, especially if they know that, being active they can achieve together something more serious, even in executive power of EU? Thank you.
So, will Salvini and Le Pen come together in some kind of a group?
I think they have already tried, and to an extent they have failed, but they may still be able to, coordinate a little bit more. Currently, there are like 3 groupings, more or less, that represent Eurosceptic views within the European Parliament. They might be able to, change that and be more coordinated. I think, it should be pointed out, none of these parties this time run on a platform of leaving the European Union. A lot of people said that's very positive. Brexit acted as a sort of vaccine in this case. But they still vowed to sort of dismantle piece by piece the European Union from within. And I would submit that that's as great a challenge as the threat of breaking the European Union. So if they can coordinate on specific issues where they may find alliances also with other parties, that's significant in and of itself. And we, as I said, we should all be happy today, but not overly complacent, because this majority that is forming is very heterogeneous. And the reason why the Liberals and the Greens were successful is also that they got the votes of disappointed, the disenfranchised people who used to vote for the Christian Democrats and the Socialists. So I really want to see how this big grouping, which remains pro-EU, is really going to coordinate on specific policies. Yeah. So I think it could still be very difficult for this majority to, in the policy-making process, to proceed with integration, and for these parties at the same time to capitalize on sort of discontent that remains very significant across European public. So it's not that the wave didn't really materialize, but it doesn't mean there are no streams anymore, that everything is quiet. I mean, I think that would be very misleading and dangerous to think at this stage.
I think it's still a strong showing. These far-right movements are clearly winning part of the cultural fight. You talked about the International of Nationalists, so that is becoming more and more of a reality. Steve Bannon being one of the forces from the outside, helping to coordinate also this. You have to imagine that in France, the National Rally was the first party for people between the age of 35 and 60. So it's a whole generation that is now in power that actually favored a National Rally over everybody else by also 26 to 30%, depending on the age. So that is massive. But they are also losing the technical fight, and mostly because they are divided among each other. So maybe Italy and France are some of the closest, but if you look at all the far-right parties or government in powers, they are divided on immigration. They're divided on the topics that they care the most about. And also, once in Brussels or in Strasbourg, they prove to be highly inefficient, completely obstructionist. They don't propose anything. The National Rally has mostly just used European money to employ people, so they're in a bunch of scandals at the moment. So they're not a force of construction, and that is a big plus for the non-nationalists, actually, that can move the agenda, the policy agenda, and the nationalists so far has not proven to be able to do so.
So let's get this gentleman right. Yes, right. And then you right after him.
Yes, I'm Benjamin Henrique from the French Embassy. Just one observation about the position of France with the Spidgen candidate. Of course, we say that it's an interesting concept, but it would be much more valuable with a transnational list, which has been rejected by the Parliament last year on a vote on 2017. So Spidgen candidate is, of course, interesting, but it's not written specifically like that in Article 17 of the treaty.
Thank you. And let's go to the gentleman right across the aisle from you.
Thank you. Rob Tobias, and I'm with the National Association of Beverage Importers as in alcoholic beverages. On a trade issue, currently the Airbus decision and the pending Boeing decisions taking a lot of my time. And the retaliatory tariffs, various essentially countries been targeted. Non-alcoholic beers hit Germany and the Netherlands. The grape-based spirits, cognac, Armagnac hit the French agriculture industry. Italy, Spain, Germany, France, all a hit on the wine. Do you see in that trade issue what is the role of the Parliament, if at all, and where might the new Commission be handling? It seems to me that's a trade issue that immediately has to be handled.
Yeah, I'm not an optimist on this topic. Let me say that first. The EU Trade Commissioner is rules and mandate bound, and for very good reasons. And we've had an excellent Trade Commissioner the past few years, and we are in this situation. I think the bottom line here is that in U.S. domestic politics, tariffs work for this administration. Every month there's a new jobs report, and there's a new reading of the Dow Jones that suggests that the economy is doing quite well. There's a lot of churn in the employment numbers, but the overall employment is good, and they seem to work very well with the base of the president. And so I don't see him as having an economic or political incentive to tone down on tariff escalation. In fact, if it escalates further with China, there's some estimate out there that's credible that EU exports would rise by 70% if all the, and so you can see that as part of the election narrative. You know, there's the EU trying to free ride on the concessions that the US is trying to extract from China, and souring, which would then have to be corrected with auto tariffs or tariffs on auto parts. So I see a high risk of that dialogue deteriorating before it gets any better, and I think the appointment of the next DG Trade is critical for that reason. There isn't broad-based pro-trade sentiment or pro-free trade sentiment in Europe to begin with, right? There was no grand coalition supporting big trade talks with the U.S. even when they were tried, before this administration.
Does the Parliament have any role anything like
Just the approval of the mandate and the boundaries of the negotiation.
I think the Parliament's role, and if I can put in my 2 cents worth here, first off, we have a very good person announced today to be head of DG Trade, to take the place of Jean-Luc Marty, who is Sabine Weygand, who has been the deputy of Michel Barnier in the Brexit talks. But I think Bart is right. There's no real role for the Parliament. The problem is that this Parliament, as Mariacha indicated at the beginning, may be a little bit more diffuse in terms of trade, and there may be many more who are looking skeptically in terms of trade, and there certainly will be more who are concerned about trade with the United States, particularly if we move forward with the 232 auto and auto parts. So if we then try to back off and to build bridges instead of putting up tariff walls with the Europeans, the reaction in Parliament will be skeptical. And it creates a climate in Brussels that is not conducive to moving forward, particularly as long as we are outside current international agreements on climate change, which is something that many in the Parliament think is a precursor to a big trade agreement. It's a little unusual, but that's the way it is, and I would expect that with the influence of the Greens, that's something that's going to be even stronger. So it doesn't have a role in what you're talking about, but it does act as a contextual position for either moving forward or back, and I'm afraid that this Parliament may not be as sympathetic as some in the past.
And it ratifies at the end.
Sorry?
It ratifies at the end.
And it has to ratify at the end, yes. But I think Bart is correct that we're maybe by the end of this Parliament, but we'd have to see. There have to be so many changes before we get there. Yes, over here, and then let's move over here. And we're going to take 2 questions and then come back.
Thank you. My name is Michael O'Farrell. I'm from Ireland. And one of the topics that hasn't been encroached on in this very enlightening session is what I would call the ongoing political stability on the western periphery of the European Union. So what would be your expectation? We've been very gratified by the support we've received in the last 2 years in the problem with the British towards Ireland in the historical context. In the new situation that's about to unfold, would you anticipate that we would continue to be supported by the Commission, by the Parliament, in the way in which we have been over the past 2 years?
So, and can we get a question over here?
Hi, my name is Nikolai Stefanuta and I work in Antoine's team. And I've had the pleasure and privilege to be a candidate in this election and to be elected to the new parliament. So I just want to give you a feedback from the streets, if I may. I was talking to many people during the campaign, many young people, and they all expect lots of things from Europe. So I wonder if this 70% majority, pro-European majority, is not also a mandate for treaty change, something that has not been mentioned yet. And when I say treaty change, I look at things where people do not understand why the Union is more powerful, such as climate change, such as defense, such as education for the young people, Erasmus, Discover Europe, and other things. So I wonder if we shouldn't start talking about treaty change, because in many of these areas, the Union lacks powers still.
So, and you said you were elected, right?
I was, yes.
Yes, congratulations. So, so Brexit, will there be any changes by the member states? Who would like to speak with that? Sophia, will Germany change its view at all given this election in terms of its really staying with the rest of the EU 27?
No, I don't think so. I think the political motivation for Berlin, and in my view on that matter for Brussels, remains clear. The red line has been set. The interests of the EU in these negotiations haven't changed. I would also hope that the commitment to Northern Ireland hasn't changed. What's interesting in the context of Brexit is how this has played out in the UK, right? Which we haven't really talked about yet. In the UK, these elections have really been, I think, yet another referendum on membership in the European Union. And even though the Brexit Party, which was formed 45 days before the elections, fared best, we still had a broad pro-Remain coalition. So things are not at all decided in a domestic context in the UK, and that is where the question mark is. I don't think the question mark is in Brussels.
Yes, Bart?
No, just to echo some of the things, and to add, the British electorate and Parliament do seem to be able to find ways to make Brexit more and more complicated at every turn. Every time you think this is about as a rock and a hard place as you can get, it gets more complicated. I agree that there is, to the extent that there's hope in British politics of dividing the EU or getting a different negotiating stance out of Brussels, I think that's in vain, and that includes everything having to do with Ireland and Northern Ireland. And I think said this earlier, 2 months from now we'll be missing Theresa May because it was someone who was talking to others.
So the other question, though, that was put before us is, we've seen this burst of, that may be too strong a word, but we've seen high turnout, and we've seen the beginnings maybe of a European polity. Is it time to address some of these fundamental questions? Is this the beginning? I mean, the last few years, whenever you say treaty change, people run and hide. So is it something now that the national governments might think about? Yes.
I covered, as a journalist, the European Constitution discussion back in the day, and I think that people are still traumatized by the experience of having these high aspirations of bringing something visionary on the forefront, and then losing it by referenda in various countries. And I feel that if anything, I've heard the argument of a treaty change from the sovereigntists as well. Okay. So giving less power to Europe on some of these issues. So it feels that it's a dangerous way to go, given this challenge, the divide that currently exists.
Treaty change would bring back to the picture also national parliaments, and with all the elections coming up and all the political instability in some countries, I think it would be a very risky bet for any country to sort of propose and to go in that direction. And I think there's so many good things that European Union institutions can do towards greater integration that doesn't require necessarily a treaty change. So until you form a sort of new consensus around new ways to integrate further, I think treaty change remains a very risky business, precisely because opportunistically many sovereigntist parties could take advantage of that and spoil the whole process. So.
There were a few more questions over here and then there. Let's get these three. I saw two next to each other, so there we go.
Hi, Balazs Rudinsky from the Center for European Policy Analysis. Thank you for the wonderful remarks, but there hasn't been much talk about the CEE regions, Central and Eastern Europe. And just reflecting to Mr. Ripoll's data that was shown, everyone was enthusiastic about the high voter turnout, but in Central Europe, there was Slovakia and the Czech Republic, the two countries that were like under 20% in 2014. And now they were still under 30%, Slovenia, Croatia under 30%, Poland and Hungary, higher turnout, but the government is usually more successfully mobilizing their supporters. And on the other hand, there was also a map, and we could see that the Eastern Bloc was more Eurosceptic or more
right.
negative feelings towards the EU, and the past few years the Three Seas initiative has come up. And do you think it's a viable alternative for these countries to the EU? Right now it's an economic alliance, really, but do you think it has potential to move forward? Thank you.
And then over here.
Hi, Graham Scott from the International Republican Institute. I wanted to ask if these election results signal anything for appetite for EU enlargement, particularly in mind excessive negotiations with North Macedonia.
And then right next to you, was there a question, final question there? No? Okay. So,
I'm sorry.
You didn't, no, it's the woman next to you. Okay.
My colleague.
Final question.
Okay, so I just had a question about global trade. So in recent discussions with the U.S. and China, the U.S. has been called an unreliable trading partner, and I know you talked about the future of U.S. relations with the EU, and how do you think these elections will reflect on that, especially as negotiations are going on between the U.S. and the EU, but then also like the U.S. and China, and that going on.
Okay, so we're going to go in the order in which we first did, starting with Sophia. If you have any comments on these or any brief, like 1 minute of final wrap-up comments, in addition to any brief answers to these questions, because we're like 1 minute per person before the witching hour. Sophia.
I'll make this very brief because I wasn't really able to understand the questions, I'm afraid. We've had some technical issues on my side, so.
Any final word on the election? Okay. All right. Emilio?
The horse trading, has just started, so stay tuned. All these questions about the future, of the European Commission, the Commission President, will be decided over the coming weeks and months. I think it will be a very long process. When it comes to EU enlargement, I really hope that Northern Macedonia will be soon on the path to become a member. But at the same time, I think the Greens and also the Liberals are pro-enlargement, but they're also very much focused on the requirements and the prerequisites for membership. So in some cases, that may also mean closer scrutiny and tougher scrutiny. When it comes to countries such as Turkey, we don't even have the time to discuss, but I think that's, largely gone, unfortunately. And the previous parliament was already against, I think the current parliament, mainly on human rights consideration, is even more against.
And do you have a favorite for the President of the Commission?
I personally don't. I think Italy will do a good job ensuring that there is, a good and professional commissioner, Italian commissioner in the next commission. I think that will already be a great result, finding the right person who can navigate this new political environment. But I will not bet on names for the next commission president.
Celia.
So thank you for pointing out that today was very much a Western European story in a way, or Southern Europe as well, maybe from the representation of the panel. I would say that we've discussed elements of fragmentation and you know, the non-surge of nationalist parties that are stories that are completely different, maybe in Hungary and or in Poland, where power was actually strengthened. They overwhelmingly won their election, and the nationalist option or sovereignist option is very strong over there. So that's all I could say for it. But this continent is still, you know, moving at different paces, depending if you look to the north, to the south, east, and west. It's a reality. And looking forward, I don't think we could imagine to have a green candidate for the president of the Commission, but I do hope and expect that some element of this new movement gets representation at the Commission level.
Okay. Bart.
Yeah, a quick comment on trade and then talk about the Commission as well. So the U.S. is deliberately not constructive on global trade issues. If you take a longer-term perspective, there's reason to be an optimist on trade. You know, the world has been moving towards more and more rule-based trade for 30, 40 years. There is widely shared concern about China's trade practices, and if you're looking for a malign actor on the global trade front, it's China, and the EU, US, and Japan agree on that. In fact, have trilateral discussions that are quite active on these very topics. So this is intellectual property theft and state subsidies, state-owned banking system, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. has, like I said, there's consensus about the topics that need to be addressed with China. The U.S. has its own tactics that the EU disagrees with, and as long as that's the case, I don't see a meaningful constructive trade dialogue getting off the ground between the EU and the U.S. In terms of the Commission and kind of the moment, there's good news in this election, but the absence of a disaster doesn't make it a success. You know, the fact that we avoided a vast amount of anti-European, anti-immigrant parties dominating the parliament, it creates important opportunities, and I think a strong head of the Commission, like I said earlier, would be helpful. And I think Verstager is the obvious one. It's high time it's a woman. And two, I'd love for people to go and underestimate her and see what happens.
And from a Southeastern European perspective, I would say both further integration of the European Union and including the Eastern European countries and the Western Balkans, by the way, by giving them like a clear pathway to European Union membership, even if the current climate is not really working in that direction, but at least having the pathway is very important. And the 3 Seas initiative, again, yes, it's important, and not only for Europe, but also for the US, and I feel that, and for Southeastern Europe, I would say, so why not make it a 4 Seas initiative as well and bring the Aegean into it as, the Mediterranean Sea into that. That would certainly help with integration, I feel.
So I want everyone to join with me in thanking our panel. I think we've had a really super discussion up here. We'll have to see who is right or wrong in terms of whether the Spitzenkandidaten survives or what, but we're just at the beginning of that process. So we look forward to having further events that will track the making of this next term of the European Union, and very much we're pleased that all of you could join us here today. So thank you, and thanks to the panel.